Hello, I'm Joe Dillette. What we're going to do in this instructional video is carve a pine tree bough, and here's the pattern. The pattern you can print out any size. There'll be a picture of the pattern for you to print out. And we're making the bough on the end of a mantle, but you can put this here design any place and on any type of wood. So what we're going to do is just talk about the basics of doing a relief carving. This is going to be a fairly shallow relief, which means we're not going to go in very deep. And even though this one is on the end of a mantle and there's an angle here, I have to be careful how deep that I'm going, especially in this area. But the design I want to flow very nicely. The drawing, I've got kind of squiggly lines that go around the pine cone. I'm going to probably, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do more of a diagonal. These are on angles that kind of crosshatch through, so I'm going to be doing it in that way. I like a model, but this particular model I have of this pine cone is pretty well spread out too much for the design. There are three tools that you are going to use in this project. The V tool is a 60-degree angle V tool. It's a fairly large one. I would say it's about 3/8 of an inch across. You have a number 3 gouge. It's a fishtail gouge, ground so it's fanned out. Number 3 is fairly straight across. And then you have a number 8, and this is the only place I use this number 8. It's about maybe 5/8 wide. It is in softening the needles on the bough. So it's just to add some texture. So this was used very little. The two main tools are your fishtail number 3 and the V tool. I transferred the design using the carbon paper and the drawing, and then after the design was on here in the pencil, I took and darkened it with the felt tip pen. Now when I'm going to outline this, I am just going to outline going around like this. Just kind of like the tips of the needles. Like that. So that's where my V tool is going to run. Kind of following like so. And as I said, we're going to cross hatch like this rather than going around in circles. This was, I just didn't want to erase it, but I wanted to see kind of how that would look. So we take the V tool. Two tools we're going to start with. One is the V tool and the other one is the gouge. This number 3 fishtail gouge that I use a lot, and this V tool. This is the angle on this V tool here is 60-degree, and it's a fairly large V tool. So I'm using a fairly large mallet, and I'm just going to go around. Now when I get to the edges, I don't want to disturb the edge, so around the perimeter I want to be able to maintain that original surface. So I'm just going to go all the way around the outside, making the stop cuts. Now I've taken the V tool, that's a 60-degree V tool, and I've gone around and did the stop cuts. Now I want to maintain the original edge here going around, so I'm going very shallow right up next to the edge like here, and I'm going deeper in these areas. I've also decided to make this pine cone a little bit deeper even after I made one cut, and that's okay. I still have enough depth to be able to do that. Now this is black walnut, so I'm using a mallet to drive the chisel through. If you were doing this in basswood, you might just push it through by hand. But the mallet gives me real nice control and also power, because the walnut is a little harder than the basswood is. So now I'm just kind of taking out my background. In removing the background up to the stop cuts, I like to use this number 3 fishtail chisel, and I'm trying to maintain that original edge. So I'm going to cut this down to the stop cuts, and then make my stop cuts a little bit deeper around the center. So after removing the stock down to the bottom of the stop cuts, I'm going to make some of the stop cuts deeper. So I'll go back to my V-tool. I am about to depth here right at the outer edge, but I want to go deeper inside. The other thing that I am doing in some of these areas, I am growing the pattern. So this was kind of thin, so I am drifting away from the line, so when I round it off, it will continue that, make that wider. This is almost to depth. I'm just going to go a little bit deeper because I want to keep that outer edge and make it deeper into the center. The same down here, just a little bit deeper, and then the further I get away from the edge, the deeper I will go. So what I'm mindful of is I have to make, even when it's shallow, I have to make this branch round first, and then I will put the texture on it. So no matter how shallow it is, here at the tip it has to look round, as well as where it's deeper here. In this area, I am going to widen both of those out, so I'm drifting into a point there. When I start doing the design, I can fine-tune that, but I'm just leaving the stock to be able to do it right now. Again, shallow here, and I'm about to depth here on the top. My stop cuts are pretty much to depth, so I'm going to start making the background as deep as I want it to be all the way around. Start smoothing that background down. Now I went a little bit below my stop cuts here, but all the needles of this branch is going to be in that area too. So I'm going to have to clean up at the end because it's not going to be a real straight line. So my V-tool is going to be going in and out. So I'm not worried about a few whiskers here left on the side. I just want to make sure right now that the background is about as deep as I want it to be. This mantle is not fastened down. It's heavy enough it can just sit on the bench, but it just shifted back a little bit, but no problem. So again, I'm going to keep the original edge right here. So I'm going to get up close to it. Not worrying about the whiskers up close. Now that the background is taken down to the depth that I want, I'm going to start rounding over all the objects. So the branches with all the pine needles are rounded, and so are the pine cones. So I'm using the number 3 gouge, the same one that I used for the background. I'm taking the sides down to where it's almost to the bottom. So the rounding starts drastically at the edge and then it's almost flat on the top, but I'm getting rid of the flat area. I want the whole thing to appear round, but this roundness is much more at the sides than at the top. The same with the pine cones. Sides have much more rounding. I'm not worried about saving the drawing at this point because I can redraw the needles on the branches and the lines for the pine cones. I'm not worried about the background here not being very smooth because I have to go back and recut that when I get the needles in. I have to redefine that edge. Right in here, I'm just going to kind of define the top of that pine cone, but the needles will probably come right down to it, so it's going to camouflage the stem of the pine cone pretty well. So right in the area where the pine cone is, it's not going to be quite as rounded because the pine cone is the stem and the needles are going to be there. In these areas where the Y is, I'm just going to carry that roundness in to kind of a channel here. And then you would do the same on the top also. Just round them the same way. Now I got it pretty well rounded. See, the reason for the channels in here is to help with the roundness. Otherwise you would have a big flat area in there. So the channels where the branches coming out, they need to go back in there a little bit. You can see it's kind of round, but look at what happened. It seems like it grew quite a bit, the fatness of all these branches. So what we're going to do is not worry too much about the background right now, because I am going to thin it out a little bit as I put the needles in. And so let's just start putting in the needles. Now the needles I'm not going to draw in because they're all in angles like that, coming down. And when it gets to the end of the branch, the needles are going around kind of like spokes on a circle. And then coming up on the side. Now the way I'm going here, the smooth cut is up next to the thin line, and the rough cut is away from it. So I'm pounding into the strength and going with the grain as I'm coming up here. If I was to come down like this here, then it would break this here needle off. And so be mindful of your grain direction. And first I do the edges, and then I roll into the top a little bit more, and I'm trying not to follow the exact same lines. So maybe spacing it maybe a little bit in between it, and not quite as deep, because now we're on the top. If you feel more comfortable with taking a pencil and redrawing all the needles back in, go ahead and do it. But I find that it's really not a necessary step. Now to thin that down a little bit, I'm going to go on the edge. And because a branch has not really got a straight edge, I'm going to go a little bit variations like that coming out. So I've got a little bit of an irregular edge. The same on this side. Then, because they're not all the same depth, some have got spaces in between, we're going to go and make some of those points a little bit heavier, but you don't want to do equally spaced. You don't want it to look mechanical. Now I'm going to do that to all the branches, and then I'm going to go back and touch up the background again. But so we're redoing defining the edge, and we will need to work on the background. So we're going to start on this one. So at first what I'm doing this, I'm kind of going equally spaced. Now the needles are going to kind of hide the stem on that pine cone. Then after I got all the kind of equally spaced, then I will go in and do the variations on it. This one I will equally space all three of these and then work it together. So I'm just representing how one of the needles come off on the one branch and how they will blend into the next branch. I'm using the same V-tool. This is that 60-degree V-tool that I did my stop cuts going around, and the only thing that I've changed here is the small mallet. So I've now got a small mallet. This is the 12-ounce mallet that I'm using now, where I was using the 24-ounce before. You can see this goes pretty fast. I was just mindful of the grain direction here. So this, I am less likely to take the points off the needles if I work from this side coming up. If you're not sure what direction to go, just kind of look at your cut and see which side is the rough side. The grain on this particular end of the mantle is plunging, and so it's not always running in the direction that you think, because we're getting close to a knot on this end, and so the grain is really plunging in a unique direction there. So now I'm going to go on the edge, make it so it's not a straight edge. Same on this edge. Now those variations, well, we need to do the edge up here yet and skinny this down a little bit more. So I'm just putting some deeper notches in right now so it doesn't look so uniform. Then I'll go back and put some finer needles on it to soften those notches that I just made in there. And don't equally space those notches. In nature, they would appear just at random. So now I'm just softening up the needles. We're going to keep the heavy ones in, and I'm going to put some light ones over the top. Give it a little softer look. And then you do the same thing with the top branch. I suppose it looks a little strange me coming this direction because it looks like I would be driving into the grain, but like I said, the grain on this piece is plunging, and so it's coming out like this. So if I go in the other direction, it would plunge in. There, the background is pretty well smoothed out. I'm going to be touching the background again when I go down and do the pine cones, so I'm not going to be too fussy about cleaning up all the whiskers yet. As I look at this now, it looks a little bit harsh where a short needle pine is softer. So what I need to do is soften this up a little bit. To soften it up, I'm going to take a gouge, and the gouge that I'm going to take is a number 8. So you can see that the radius is pretty rounded on this number 8, and I'm going to walk this just lightly across the surface, just kind of very lightly kissing the surface. And what this is doing, well, it looks like it's raising a lot of whiskers here, but I'm cutting off the edges, the sharp edges, and that's what's doing the softening here a little bit. So I'm just selectively just hitting some of those real harsh areas and softening it up a little bit. Now I'm not worried about all these whiskers because the cut is so light that I can brush most of those whiskers out of there. So it's very subtle what I'm doing here. Notice the direction that I'm going. When I rock it this way, I'm making cuts this way. So I'm rocking it right along the same, making cuts the same direction as the needles would be. And that does a lot to soften the look up. And that's kind of the look that I'm after. Walking the chisel is very nice for putting in textures. And I'm just doing it selectively, looking at the areas that are a little bit too harsh and just softening them up a little bit. Now there's a lot of whiskers, as you can see. The brush that I use is a stiff bristle. It's a chip brush, and I just scrub it on over the surface. And that takes those whiskers right off there. It just breaks them off. That's what it does. Now for doing the pine cone, I'm going to go in kind of that crosshatch direction. This direction. And I'm thinking of making about 5 cycles, 5 cuts. And about the same here, about the same spacing. This one here will be high. Now there's one thing to keep in mind in doing these crosshatch cuts. I'm going to use the same 60-degree chisel. Looking for my mallet. Here it is. Which direction to go first? Well, you go in the hardest direction first. By hardest, I mean when I'm coming up here, that direction is more against the grain than if I go this way, because the grain's going this way on the mantle, so these cuts here are going to be easier. So what I do is the direction that's most against the grain to start with, and the other direction then is more with the grain. Now the reason for that is you have less chipping out. If I go this direction first, coming across on this line here, so if I made that first and then come to do this cut here, I would be breaking this one off, you see, as I would come to each of those cuts. So I want to do the one that's mostly across the grain first, and then do the one that is more with the grain. So now the points are the points that are sticking out the furthest. So I am going to accentuate the points kind of like this. I'm laying my V-tool almost on the side, so the top wing is coming out perpendicular, and I'm kind of undercutting under it. So if you look at this one here, that wing is, top wing here is sticking out at you, and the bottom wing is cutting there. Because these points here are supposed to be sticking out the furthest. Then I'll come up on the side and stick the point out further there. So I'm just cutting back the sides. This is a little bit too long here. Make that point stick out more, so I'm going to take that up higher there. So that point right there sticks out more. So what I really wanted to demonstrate on the second pine cone is that first cut, that going as much against the grain. So the one that is the hardest to cut in goes first. The next one is going more with the grain, and that will be the one that goes second. So this not only goes for pine cones, but anytime you're cross hatching or you're doing any kind of a checkered design, that's thing to be mindful of is going in the hardest direction, the most against the grain for your first cut. So the second direction with the grain, there is no chance of breaking out here. So so to bring those points out more, I'm using now the fishtail, the same number 3 fishtail gouge that I was using on the background. And this area right here in particular, where you're trying to get that point stick out, I'm taking the points of the fishtail gouge and I'm just working them back in. What I'm trying to do is accentuate the points, making it look more like a pine cone. Part of this pine cone is a little hidden by the branch.